But to begin with, of course, the expanding human footprint of cities, it's swallowing up the hinterlands whole, right? So there's this vast expand. There's two kinds of things going on. One is that the nature inside the city, ecosystems inside the cities themselves are getting hugely affected. And the second is the impact that we don't see within the cities. We see, our roads are in disarray, we don't have any trees, we breathe polluted air, we choke on our sewage and our solid waste. What we don't see is the villages around us, which are doing the same and are not, for sort of, at least we made a choice to live in the city, and they're doing this because not because of out of a choice and out of certain benefits. So I think we're getting increasingly disconnected from the impact that our city has on the hinterland around. So that's one thing that I see. And the second is, where is the scope then for change? That's something we really need to look at, because when we are looking at urban planning, we are just not envisaging what to with our ecosystems. The focus is so much on services and understanding urban services in a very, so looking at things like, the most it would go to ecosystems looking at waste and sanitation. That's the closest link, or the health link maybe that you see. But looking at urban services in a broader sense of what ensures human well-being or quality of life in a city, where do you have open spaces, where do you have parks, where do you have places for communities to interact, or livelihood uses or commons uses in the city, public spaces, all of that is just out of the entire planning debate. And that, I think, is something that we need to really look at. How do we do this in the future? I think one of the things to begin with is that there's not much policy in terms of what can we effectively do about ecosystem changes. At the most, as I said, you have something that says we have a target for greening the cities. You have to have so many trees planted. But in terms of a holistic appreciation of what it means to be an ecosystem, and an ecosystem in a city, we don't have that. Where it's not a natural ecosystem, but a social ecological system where humans are as much a part of the system as the nature itself. But then on the implementation front, either there is implementation which is very technocratic in focus and doesn't take into account the social needs, or the social needs implementation is done in such a way that it only focuses on things like the recreational aspect of nature, or maybe at most groundwater recharge is another thing that people focus on in cities, and that misses a large number of the other intangibles, the cultural services that ecosystems play for us, the livelihood uses that they have, the subsistence uses that they have, the way in which they function as a node for commons, community building, community spirit, all of that gets left out. So I think that implementation has to be done by people, not by the government only. I mean, some things, of course, the government has to do, but that whole interface of government to people and how does that work in terms of the actual interface, that gets missing. But I think one of the biggest achievements of the chapter was its inclusion itself, or the fact that this was raised. It's the first time in an IPCC mitigation report that you've had cities or human settlements as an option for mitigation which is addressed. Until now, cities have only been looked at in terms of their adaptations and their risks. And this, I think, is really significant, especially for India, because we are still looking at, very much in this mode of looking at how do cities adapt to climate change, if at all we look at the issue of climate change. We haven't really looked at how can you mitigate climate change and especially given the context of our growing urbanization, we need to look at it this way. So for instance, how do you plan cities? Do you have densified cities, or do you have low density, high range cities? So that's a question, because if you have high density cities, you can have infrastructure savings, so you don't have large transport distances, but your footprint becomes very intensive on that small piece of land, so you might go really deep in terms of groundwater. So these are trade-offs that we need to think of. And also, how do you plan your green spaces? You could have a lot of mitigation in terms of the air pollution or the carbon, in terms of just planting trees in cities, which have much more potential for mitigation than you have trees in rural areas. There are a lot of things I think we need to explore on those fronts, which are very important lessons from the chapter. That question is an interesting one. I don't think there is one lever. Where I think our policy to implementation always fails is that there are multiple levels of translation. So there's the policy, who makes the policy, for instance, often even government departments outsource the policy making. So your plan, especially municipalities, the plan is always developed by some third party agency typically. And so, and then who implements the plan? And finally, when it comes to the real estate developer, or the single person building their home or various other things, then the plan is never made into so there are these different steps through which this plan passes till the last stage of implementation. At each step you must have the translation, and you must have somebody doing that translation, and I think that's what we mix, this multi-level coordination across levels. Who does that and who does the translation? So much gets lost. It's like Chinese whispers. At the end, what comes out is not what went into that plan. And that, I think, if we can get that taken care of, but that's much more than just making the plan. That's staying with the plan every inch of the way, right, till it gets implemented. Whereas often making the plan is a step, and that's done, and you assume that that project is done, that time phase is done, and you've signed off, and then you can't get what you need. I think IIHS or organizations like IIHS could play a very important role in exactly doing this kind of bridging, which requires continuous, sustained engagement with different kinds of stakeholders at different levels. Saying, at each place, how do you do this translation, or who will do this translation? Having local workshops across the city or across multiple cities, getting people to talk to each other, maybe getting best practices known from one place to another, getting learnings translated. A lot of those training programs, there's many multiple places in which IHS could play a role in exactly this, because this is our biggest gap. Not that our policies are not good enough, but that there is no implementation of the policies.